Hello and welcome to the overview for session 6. For the next few weeks we're going to look at different cohorts of people or factors that have had an impact or impacted on sport. And the first cohort that we're going to look at is that of the Indigenous Australian. Indigenous Australians have a history of poor treatment at the hands of white Australia. A few brief examples of this would include the fact that Tasmania's entire Indigenous Australian population was wiped out. Then, of course, there was the stolen generation fiasco where Indigenous children were taken from their family and given to white families to raise because white Australia believed that they knew better than Indigenous Australians. Then there was also the fact that the Indigenous Australian population was not even acknowledged as being human. Did you know that in early census material they were actually considered fauna, and they were only actually added to the census data in terms of the population in the late 1960s? So issues like this have had an effect on their population. Unfortunately, you will see that the health status of Indigenous Australians is much lower to that of a non-Indigenous Australian. For example, they have a lower life expectancy to that of a non-Indigenous Australian by approximately 10 years. They're much more likely to be detained, so adults are 13 more times likely to be in jail than that of a non-Indigenous Australian, and Indigenous juveniles are 24 times more likely to be incarcerated than a non-Indigenous Australian. We know that their education level is lower than that of a non-Indigenous Australian, and that their household income is much lower than that of a non-Indigenous Australian. So, why do we look at these factors when this subject is about the sociology of sport? Well, as you should be aware, sport doesn't occur within a vacuum. There is a history, and this history will have an effect on participation for those people that have been affected. Now, the Australian Federal Government has looked at the poor health status of Indigenous Australians and decided that they needed to do something to try and improve their long-term health. And as a result, they've put into action many initiatives. And one of those initiatives was called Close the Gap. And what it was about, it was to try and increase the participation of Indigenous Australians in sport. Participation in sport, with all its potential health benefits, was seen as a way that they could try and do that, to bring the health benefits closer and close that gap between the status of both Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. However, even in terms of sport, Indigenous Australians have and continue to encounter racism both on and also off the field. In more recent times, there has been a decrease in overt racism, which is great because very strong penalties apply for anyone who's caught vilifying an Indigenous Australian person, whether we're talking about another sporting player or a spectator. However, there seems to still be quite a few issues in terms of inferential racism and also enlightened racism. So we're going to look at some instances where sport appears to have had a positive effect on some of the Indigenous Australian population. However, we are also going to look at an article which suggests that the so-called positive effects of participation for Indigenous Australians in sport may not be nearly as strong as what it appears in the literature. Thank you.